Here we are, pleasant afternoon, pleasant for some, unpleasant for others. Now I'd like to talk about King Canute and the buffoon in Washington, because there is an analogy. One had some brains and the other one was so consumed with his self-importance that nothing except his wishes matter. Now King Canute, I think it was the 10th or 11th century, was a very successful, built a successful empire, invading and conquering England, as well as Denmark. I think he was originally from Denmark, and parts of Sweden and Norway. So he had an extensive empire. And he was considered to be the greatest king of his time. But he was a man who was aware of his own mortality. And he was aware of the flattery, which was an essential component of his court, how people flattered him, calling him the King of Kings. And the story goes that he was told by the flatterers in his court that he was strong enough to turn back the tides. Now the story has got a little bit confused in its retelling, and people say that King Canute felt he was so important that he could turn back the tides. It was the other way around. It was his courtiers, the flatterers in the court, who told him that. And he knew this was a ridiculous proposition. Now let's look at the situation in the United States of America, or should I say the divided States of America. Because let's not forget, you can't judge a country or the people in a country by its rulers. We mustn't forget that Adolf Hitler, came to power through parliamentary means. And not that I'm comparing the buffoon in Washington with Adolf Hitler, but the buffoon in Washington is now serving his second 4-year term as President of the United States of America, courtesy of the American electorate, who swallowed the idea that a billionaire who's only interested in the personal fortunes of himself and his immediate family would somehow help those Americans who had been marginalised and ostracised through the globalisation, corporatisation revolution that saw large sections of American industry die. So here we have an electorate faced with the challenge of re-electing the same people who, though make some legislation at the margins which assists people, which are basically in the pockets of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, or get a new brush, get a fresh brush. Now obviously a lot of Americans forgot that over 1 million Americans died during the COVID pandemic. 1 million. Because of the anti-COVID propaganda, which was being spewed out by large sections of the Republican Party. Now, as if those million didn't die. And let's not forget, although the United States of America is concerned about drug importation, the effect it has on its population, let's not forget it was the FBI and CIA which introduced crack into Afro-American communities in the 60s and early 70s to destroy the Black Panther movement, a movement which had quite radical political objectives. And let's not forget that more Americans have died as a result of the endone epidemic, which was promoted to increase the coffers of Big Pharma, or even talking about 50,000 a year. But that's reality. Now obviously, the buffoon in Washington was able to convince a majority of voting Americans that he was the way forward. Now King Canute realised he was a mere mortal. He realised he couldn't turn back the tides, irrespective of what the flatterers around him said. If we look at the situation in the United States of America in 2026, we have a Congress where the Republicans have a majority. We have a Senate where the Republicans have a majority. And we have a stacked Supreme Court, which in many ways means that as long as the flatterers think their personal position and their re-election prospects are tied to the coattails of the buffoon in Washington, they're happy to pass any type of legislation to highlight the power he's able to exercise. Now we've seen some extraordinary things happen, but extraordinary things happens all the time. If you look at world history, it's full of extraordinary things. We saw the removal, physical removal of the President of Venezuela and his wife. We've seen the bodgy peace which has been stitched together in Gaza, and we've seen a so-called peace committee composed solely of United States supporters of the buffoon in Washington, and the buffoon in Washington chairing that particular committee to rebuild Gaza. We've now seen the ridiculous situation where America, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the main stumbling block regarding Russia and the demise of the Warsaw Pact. We've now seen the major player in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization attempt to steal the property of another member, Denmark. And it's fascinating to see that the people in Greenland, a colonial expansion of Denmark, the 54,000 people living in Greenland, the majority of whom are Inuit, indigenous people, now being the meat in the sandwich between this desire for the buffoon in Washington to acquire Greenland, he claims, to defend the United States of America. Now the reality is, Denmark has had a relationship with the United States of America for over 200 years. And let's not forget there were major United States bases in Greenland during the Cold War. And although the current base only has 200 United States personnel, it is still a United States base in Greenland. And there is no way that the Danish Prime Minister and the Danish Parliament wouldn't allow the expansion of US bases in Greenland. At the same time, the issue is, as we saw in Venezuela, it's about oil. Now, in Greenland, the situation escalated to such a degree that members of NATO are sending troops into Greenland to protect it from a possible invasion from the United States of America, which obviously would mean the end of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we have this buffoon who thinks he can turn back the tides doing what he likes, when he likes, because of the spineless and gutless Republican Party, which has basically been dominated by those poor folk in the Make America Great movement. But we're starting to see a little bit of resistance. We're starting to see a few Republicans in the Senate and the Congress who may have some minor skeletal framework in their body beginning to stand up. In the last few days we've seen the Senate reject a bill which went through Congress, which was to cut funding for science in the United States of America. Here we have the buffoon in Washington, who he loves to tell us is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Defence Forces, doing what he can to expand his financial interests. Because it's very probable that there'd be more United States bases in Greenland. The Danes wouldn't. Obviously the Greenlanders would complain, but the Danes wouldn't complain. There could even be treaties regarding mineral extraction. Now the whole purpose of demonising the Venezuelan leadership, and obviously they've got more than their own shortcomings, but what was done was to ensure the United States of America had supplies of oil, and it's the same about Greenland. It's about ensuring they have access to rare earths. So, this is a dilemma that the whole world faces. Now obviously, the Russian dictatorship and the Chinese dictatorship are playing the buffoon in Washington for all he's worth. In many regards, he reminds me of Mussolini. In all show, all pomp, but very little substance. So, with the congressional elections and governor elections coming up in November this year, there are supporters of the buffoon in Washington who are getting cold feet because they're concerned not about Venezuela or Greenland or Ukraine or NATO. What they're concerned about is the people in the United States of America. What are the policies which are being pursued by the buffoon in Washington, the effect it's having, it's going to have, slashing access to healthcare is a big one. The unprecedented way that ICE, the immigration, system which has been set up to deport so-called illegal immigrants, is acting like a paramilitary force in some of the major cities in the country. Men with balaclavas over their faces, with automatic weapons, in camouflage, running around the streets of the United States of America, breaking every law known to the United States of America to enforce this policy. And then you have the issues regarding housing. And now that a anti-vaxxer is head of the health department, we are beginning to see the health effects in the United States of America. So the buffoon in Washington and the flatterers, I don't blame the buffoon. People knew what he was like. People knew that he was self-centered, that he was a narcissist, that all he was interested in is increasing his and his family's wealth and power. People knew that. I blame the flatterers who are not willing to tell him what his policies are doing. Let's forget out Gaza and Venezuela and Greenland and the Ukraine. Let's look at the internal policies. Let's look how it's pauperising people, how it's marginalising people. Where are the jobs that were going to be created? Look at the way the legal system has been manipulated to try to ostracise and punish his so-called political enemies. Look at the way the Supreme Court is no longer a court which looks at the Constitution, but a court which panders and flatters the buffoon in Washington. Look at those representatives in the Republican Party in the House of Congress and the Senate who, through fear of losing pre-selection, have forgotten that their primary responsibility is not to the party that pre-selects them, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican or who knows what else, but their primary responsibility is to the people who they represent. And when, in a democratic society, we have leaders who wield absolute power, corruption is part and parcel of that equation. And the corruption that we see in the United States of America, where the country is nothing more than a playground for billionaires and everybody else is manipulated to fight each other because of so-called differences which pale into insignificance when you look at the difference between most Americans and those billionaires who have bankrolled the buffoon so they can increase their power and wealth. The United States of America could be a great society. Occasionally it has done the right thing. Currently it is nothing more than an extension of the imperial power it was. It will use economic embargoes, use tariffs, bullying tactics, military means, anything at its disposal to ensure that the interests, not of the country, not the interests of the United States of America, not the interests of its citizens, but the interests of the oligarchs and the billionaires and the buffoon take precedence over everywhere else. Now, King Canute would be turning in his grave to see Buffoon, the buffoon in Washington, act. He wouldn't turn in his grave because of the buffoon. There are buffoons everywhere, but he'd be turning in his grave because of the flatterers around the buffoon which have allowed him to go on and on about issues which have nothing to do with making the people of America a secure, profitable, inclusive society.